Welcome everyone. My name is Diarmuid Torney. I'm co-director of the Centre for Climate and Society here in DCU, and we're all very welcome. We're very pleased to welcome you all to this morning's seminar. Thank you to our four speakers for joining us. I'll say a bit more about them in just a few minutes. We have a mix here of DCU colleagues, current students on our Masters in Climate Change, some incoming students on our Masters in Climate Change who may be visiting DCU for the first time. We have a couple of alumni, and we have colleagues and friends from policymaking and civil society also. So you're all very welcome. Today's seminar takes place in the framework of a Jeanne network, so an EU-funded network of universities across Europe focusing on the European Green Deal. It's called GreenDeal-NET, and it brings together research and teaching on various aspects of the European Green Deal, European climate and sustainability governance. And one of the aims of the network is to actively reach out to policy circles, to civil society and wider society. And so hopefully today's event is fulfilling that aim. We're delighted in particular to welcome Vilja Johansson, who is a PhD student from the University of Eastern Finland. University of Eastern Finland is one of the other universities within the GreenDeal-NET network. And so when Vilja applied as part of the visiting researcher scheme within the network to come to Ireland, I could see a very clear connections to policy debates and interest here in Ireland. So we're very pleased to be hosting Vilja for a few weeks here at the moment. The event hopefully is also timely and useful for work in policy and civil society circles. As you know, the debate around just transition is proceeding in Ireland. The programme government concluded a commitment to establish a just transition commission, and I understand work is ongoing in that regard, including formation of an advisory task force this autumn. And in due course, the development of indicators to measure progress in transition. So hopefully the discussions that we have here today will help to inform those policy-making processes. We are delighted to be joined by four speakers, and what I'll do is introduce them all at the start so that I'm not kind of jumping back in interrupting the flow. So our first speaker will be Vilja Johansson, who is a PhD student at the Centre for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Eastern Finland, and as I said, a visiting researcher here at DCU, and I understand will be going on to Brussels to look at EU just transition processes after leaving us here in Dublin. Her research focuses on the evolving legal practices relating to just transition in international, EU and comparative law. So Vilja will be starting our discussion, and then that will be followed by contributions from our three other speakers, the first of whom will be Dr. Louise Fitzgerald, who has just joined us here in the School of Law and Government as an assistant professor in the last you're here a week or 10 days, yeah. Very, very welcome, Louise. I'm not sure if you're listed on the website of the Centre for Climate and Society yet as a member. We're very much hoping that you'll become an active member of the centre as well. Louise's research focuses broadly on issues of justice in environmental topics and how to develop more just and inclusive sustainability transitions, including focusing on the role of equality, diversity and inclusion in energy transformation and the justice implications of forestry policy. Dr. Jeanne Moore also has a connection to us here in DCU. She's a policy analyst at the National Economic and Social Council and a member of the advisory board of our Centre for Climate and Society here in DCU. Jeanne primarily worked on climate and sustainable development projects in NET, and the Council's most recent report, Just Transition in Agriculture and Land Use, was published in July of this year. Our final speaker will be Sadhbh Neill, who is the Climate Campaign Coordinator of Friends of the Earth and a coordinator of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. She's also a member of the Centre for Climate and Society here in DCU and has a very significant range of experience across academia, civil society, and activism, and also the policy world. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a rich diversity of expertise across our four speakers. We're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then there'll be plenty of time to open up for discussion after that. So at this point, I'll hand over to Vilja.
Hi all, and thanks for the warm introduction. I'm really pleased to be here in Dublin, and really delighted to be able to speak in such great company. So yes, as the title indicates, I'll be talking about my research that focuses on the concept of a just transition, and especially on its on the use of the concept in framework laws on climate change. So yeah, shortly about the background. Why are we talking about a just transition? So as many of you will know, just transition is a concept that gained increased relevance in climate debates during the past years. It's a concept that I guess draws attention to the fact that even though climate measures are more than necessary, they do not affect everyone equally. But instead that different social groups, different sectors of the economy, and different regions have differing capabilities to adapt to the quite fast and even structural changes that are brought about by effective climate policy. So against this background, governments are increasingly recognizing the, let's say, social dimension of climate policies, also in climate legislation, and many times by using the concept of a just transition. So just transition was first included in international climate law in 2015 in the Paris Agreement's preamble, and has since been included in EU, so regional climate law, and also then in national and subnational climate legislation. And then you could ask, why is this new legal practice interesting? If you ask me, I'll have many answers, but I guess one of the answers is that, or the reasons is that there's still a lot of uncertainty relating to the concept, and it's quite a novel, let's say, legal practice. So there's really not a clear definition on, or a unanimous definition of what a just transition means, or any clear roadmap for how to implement it. So questions arise as to what type of justice are we referring to, just for whom, but also then what are the mechanisms that could be used for actually ensuring the justness of climate policies. And kind of based on this, I would argue that there's a value in looking at the existing practices that we have in legislating for just transition. And by looking at these cases, kind of trying to draw some conclusions as to what the role of law could be in ensuring or supporting just transition. And kind of against this background, I'm looking at two specific themes. So first of all, kind of the definition of a just transition and how the concept has been defined in different legislation. But I'm also looking or interested in looking at the different mechanisms and elements that are used for trying to implement the concept through legislation and related policy. So as you can see here, I've highlighted 4 different cases or laws that I'll be drawing on in this presentation. So first of all, the Scottish Climate Change Act from 2019, followed by the Irish and Spanish Act from 2021. And then I've also included the South African Climate Change Bill that was released last year, but still, as it's still, or as the work for the legislation is still ongoing, some of the aspects that I mentioned might still change. So that is good to bear in mind. But yeah, without further ado, let's go to the first part, so relating to the definition. As you can see here, I've highlighted the definitions of a just transition that can be found in the Scottish, Irish, and the proposed South African Climate Change Act. And as you can see, Spain is not included here, as Spain has not actually defined just transition in any explicit or even implicitly in their climate change law. I guess the first thing I would want to kind of highlight that comes out of these definitions is that there's a clear somehow understanding that there's really no just transition without a transition. So a low carbon or net zero transition is really seen as a prerequisite for having a just transition at all. And I think this is an interesting and relevant point to highlight, as it kind of answers to criticisms or worries that focusing a lot on the justice of the transition might somehow slow down the transition or so. But I would argue that based on these definitions, it actually seems as the whole focus on just transition is a way to actually accelerate the transition, mostly by creating social acceptance for it. And this kind of goes on to the following point, that the concept of a just transition clearly kind of introduces a new social justice requirement to climate policy. And this is done mostly through the focus on distributional measures. So there's a clear focus first on employment opportunities and decent work. And I guess this is not this doesn't come as a surprise, as just transition has its roots the concept of a just transition has its roots in labor movements and has actively been advocated specifically by trade unions in climate policy. But in addition to this focus on employment or creating employment opportunities and decent work, there's also a clear recognition that other groups are affected in addition to the workforce. So, for example, in the Irish definition, you can see a provision highlighting support for persons and communities that may be negatively affected by the transition. So, kind of encompassing other groups than solely the workforce. And then as a third measure, or kind of a third focus relating to these distributional measures, is a clear kind of recognition that addressing existing inequalities and poverty eradication are seen as important measures for implementing a just transition as well. And this is evident, or this is shown in the Scottish and South African definitions. Then, especially in the Scottish definition, you can also see a clear focus on participatory or clear participatory focus, where they kind of state that or believe that a social consensus is essential for creating a just transition, and that public participation is an essential part of that. And even though this participatory focus isn't kind of really expressed explicitly in the Irish or proposed South African definitions, there is a clear focus on participation in later implementing documents. So this is a focus that is visible in the other cases as well, also in the Spanish case. And I guess this comes to the last point, that even though the concept has been defined in these laws, it has also been, let's say, redefined or extended or specified in later policy documents. And I think this comes to show that it's quite, I guess, challenging and challenging to kind of specify a really concrete definition of just transition, and that there's kind of an interest in in expanding or changing it in later processes as well, or kind of maybe more specifying it. Was that all? Yes. So then going over to kind of the implementation part, I've decided to highlight 4 different elements that I think are somehow arising from the different case studies as key features of implementing a just transition. And some of these are included or established through the Climate Change Act or laws, but some of them are then also established through later policy documents. So I guess depending on where they are established or through what mechanisms, it gives them a bit of a different status. But if we look at the first element, so the planning framework, I would say that here there are 2 different approaches that the chosen cases have adopted. So first of all, there's the first approach would be to include just transition measures and planning for a just transition in existing planning frameworks within the Climate Change Act. So plans relating to how to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And I would say that this is kind of the approach taken in Scotland and also, I guess, partly here in Ireland. Then the other approach would be or the other approach coming from the cases is to create specific planning framework for just transition policy. And this is something that has been done in, for example, Spain, where they have a just transition strategy that needs to be reviewed every 5 years. And they've also created these just transition agreements that focus more on regional and sectoral just transition policies. And then I guess the other 2 pieces of the puzzle or elements relate to kind of who gets to be involved in these processes of planning and implementing a just transition. So if we start with the upper one, there's a clear recognition in all of the cases that there's value in receiving some sort of scientific or expert advice on just transition policies. And here again, there are different approaches that have been adopted. So the first one would be to expand the mandate of existing advisory bodies that have been created to advise on climate change mitigation or adaptation policies, to also include just transition measures, or let's say kind of the advising on the social dimension of climate policies. And I guess reading or based on the climate action plan or the most recent climate action plan here in Ireland, this is actually something that kind of I would say that this is an approach that has been adopted here. Then I guess the other approach would be to, well, that's coming from the cases as well, is to establish specific just transition or an institution that specifically advise on just transition policies. And this has been done in Scotland, in Spain, and also in South Africa. So in Scotland, they created a non-statutory Just Transition Commission. In Spain, they have created a Just Transition Institute that has, as one of the bodies, a specific advisory council on just transition policies. And in South Africa, they've created it's called a Presidential Climate Commission that also has a similar mandate. And I know that, as Diarmuid said, there's been discussions of establishing something similar here in Ireland, and I'm really keen on maybe continuing or discussing that later on as well. Then what's interesting is that these commissions or institutes have also been given, or kind of are seen as platforms for facilitating stakeholder engagement. So in many cases, the councils or commissions are or have representation from different stakeholder groups. But also, in addition to kind of providing scientific or expert advice on just transition and being a platform for stakeholder engagement, these commissions or councils are also seen as the ways of facilitating public participation more broadly. So, for example, creating platforms where public participation can take place, or then by actually doing research or going out and talking to people and asking how the transition is affecting them. So you can see that these just transition commissions are given a kind of a huge governance role in these processes. But in addition to the roles that I've already mentioned, they're also in all of the cases where they have been established, so in Scotland, Spain, and in South Africa, they've also given a monitoring role. So kind of moving over to the last element, that kind of has to deal with, or I think the last element is really essential for kind of securing that the planned policies and all the processes relating to those actually take place. So in many of the cases, the Just Transition Commissions have also been given a role to monitor the implementation of Just Transition policies. And then just as the last kind of point relating to report review and accountability, I think it's good to mention that in addition to these Just Transition Commissions or institutions, the Scotland has taken an approach to also explicitly connect just transition measures to the existing review or reporting review and accountability mechanisms that they have established in terms of climate measures in the Climate Change Act, which I think is also a kind of a good example of how these kind of accountability or scrutiny of just transition measures can also be strengthened, even in addition to these just transition commissions and institutions. I think I'll end there. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
So yeah, thank you so much, Diarmuid, for the invite. Yeah, for the really interesting presentation, which I think offers us a great comparative perspective of what's going on, and of course for all of you for being here today. So I'm very grateful to talk about, to have the chance to talk about just transition, and I'll be speaking today from my research, which, as Diarmuid has outlined, is really focusing on the questions of justice in environmental policy and in the transition, and particularly, as Diarmuid mentioned, drawing on my work on energy transitions and also forestry impacts in Ireland and the EU more broadly. So I'd like to focus in particular on what has been said already about the distributive impacts of the transition and bring in some perspectives which I feel are often overlooked in discussions of the just transition, particularly in Ireland, but are really essential knowledges that we have to reflect on and take into account if we want to achieve a just transition or perhaps any transition at all. So as we saw in the presentation, broadly the cause of just transition is about ensuring that the transition to low carbon societies is developed in an inclusive way. So NESC, based on the work of Jeanne and Sinead Mercier, have proposed, I think, a really useful definition of a just transition, which is one that seeks to ensure the transition is fair, equitable, and inclusive in terms of processes and outcomes. So some of you might be familiar with just transition in Ireland, around how it has taken shape, for example, to help support areas of the Midlands, which have been dependent on peat, to transition their economies through programs such as training and reskilling. But I'd like to kind of span out from this a bit more and offer a kind of broader perspective of looking at the distributive impacts of how the transition is being pursued in Ireland at the moment. So speaking from my research, what I'm seeing is that certain communities, often in rural places, are being disproportionately impacted by how the transition is being pursued in Ireland at the moment. In Leitrim, for example, where much of my research has been based, communities are facing significant socially and environmental negative impacts, which are arising in the name of transition. And communities are really seeking to highlight these impacts and the broader impacts and injustices that are happening as a result of the transition approach. So I'm thinking here of places such as Dua Mountain, which is located in northern Leitrim, where there are plans to build 18 of the largest wind turbines in Europe on a mountain bog. And the local community, through groups such as Save Dua Mountain, are highlighting the ecological biodiversity impact of the rare species that live in these areas, protected species such as the hen harrier, the community impacts and risk of landslides, as well as to local businesses, as well, of course, of the carbon impact of building turbines on a bog, which we all know is one of our most important carbon sinks. Such communities in places like Leitrim are also facing the prospect of silver and gold mining, and there's dozens of mining prospecting licenses which have been already granted in these areas, with of course associated environmental and social impacts, yet which is being presented as necessary to give us the metals that we need for the transition to take place. And finally, these communities for decades have also been facing the ecological and community impact of our approach to forestry in Ireland, which is predominantly non-native monoculture and industrial forestry, so rather a kind of a crop of timber than how we might think of forestry. And for my research, which now for about 6 years has been visiting and speaking with communities in Leitrim, really I've heard from community members about the social isolation, the lack of access to land that's arising from forestry, as well as the really significant environmental and biodiversity impacts of this approach and this model of forestry, which groups such as Save Leitrim have been seeking to highlight. So across these examples, which really are reflected across the island of Ireland, we see that the impacts of the transition are unevenly distributed, and they're often impacting exactly those communities that have been historically marginalised. So this is very much counter to the ideas that we might have around fairness, equity, and justice in how we want to shape transition outcomes. And across the country, communities are protesting and seeking to resist these impacts. And my sense is that there's often a tendency to dismiss these voices, and particularly those voices coming from rural places, and to kind of point at the urgency that we need green energy, we need forests to deal with biodiversity and climate issues, we need mining for precious metals in the context of the transition. However, what I would contend is that these points of contest and these voices of communities facing the impact of how the transition is happening are really essential knowledges that we need to reflect on and listen to in terms of the shortcomings of current approaches. I think they offer us important points of reflection and also signs of how we could do things better and more just. There's just 3 things I'd like to reflect on of what I personally have learned from and seen within these communities. The first is what they really raise are important questions of justice, and has been brought up in the presentation of, who is this transition for? What is it for? These communities really point to the fact that they're facing the costs of the transition through, for example, extensive wind turbine development, but this energy isn't benefiting them or their communities and is often going to urban centres. And as we know, things such as data centres, so which are incredibly energy intensive. So really they're posing very legitimate questions about, what are we doing? Whose interests is this serving? And really what society do we want when we're seeking to transition our society? They also point to the on-the-ground impact and the real need to pay attention to how the transition is happening right now, because the important point is if we don't pay attention to the shortcomings, these are going to be accelerated through, for example, EU programs like the Green New Deal, or our push at a national level to transition our society. I think the important thing is that it was brought up really comprehensively in the presentation is around this question of social consensus and social acceptability. And I think my sense is that we're losing people in how the transition is being approached. And for these people, it's often actually the state who's facilitating the negative impacts that they see through granting prospecting licenses, through pursuing wind turbine development and the particular model of forestry. So we're really, I think, unless we bear these in mind, we're really not going to have a transition, just or otherwise, because we're going to lose the people and we're going to undermine the very important social dimension of the transition. Because really what these people are talking about are the significant ecological and social justice impacts of how the transition is being pursued. And this is really, really important knowledge. Within this as well, I would say they also offer us a vision for alternative approaches. So an alternative to the current way the transition is being approached, which many understand as extractivist. So very much continuing the kind of problematic patterns that got us to these environmental and social crises in the first place, through seeking to exploit and extract natural resources, as well as wealth from communities and nature alike. So rather they advocate really, I think, for what we could call a regenerative economy, which is about moving away from such practices. It's about wealth staying in communities through economies that are place-based, communities having more of a democratic say in how their regions develop, and really centering the importance of ecological and social well-being. And in places like Leitrim, people are already taking care of nature. They're already taking care of one another and showing us the ways that this can be done. And I really feel that this offers us hope if we ensure that the transition, rather than undermining, actively celebrates and nurtures these emerging practices to allow for just and sustainable transitions and futures to flourish. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to discussing further.
Thanks very much, Louise, for that insight into your pathway and research. Next up, we have Jeanne Moore.
Thanks, Diarmuid, for asking me to be here today, and it's great to join you all and engage on just transition, which always gives me both hope and curiosity about how it's all going to unfold in Ireland. So we're at a key pivotal point, so it's great to have this opportunity to chat. And thanks, Vilja, for a really interesting, really comprehensive way and succinctly put of looking at just transition from that kind of, I suppose, the strategic legal perspective. And I think you did. I think that for me, the interesting slide is the implementation one, and the sort of the doing of just transition. And I think how the practices, institutions in different countries actually really, I suppose, bring to life the principles of just transition is something that I think we're all really interested in this room. And I think there are multiple functions in just transition that we've seen through your presentation and others, and they don't all have to be carried by one institution or one area. And I think it's about thinking about how they integrate and how they all working in the same direction. And that sort of sense of awareness of just transition not being one size fits all, and how we actually tailor it to the contextual nature of what we're doing in a particular country. And I followed Scotland with some interest because I think they've managed to have the commission, the sort of the independent commission, but they've also got a ministerial role for just transition. They have a policy unit, and they have the legislation. So they have found a way of putting it in multiple ways, multiple strands. And I think how they connect up is what's interesting. So for those who don't know me, Jeanne Moore, I'm from the National Economic and Social Council, and we are a body in Ireland that provides advice to the Taoiseach government about strategic economic, environmental and social issues. And we have a council including representatives of business and employer organisations, trade unions, farmers, community and voluntary sectors, and the environmental organisations, as well as heads of government departments and independents. And we're very grateful to have Diarmuid Torney as one of our independent members. We're 50 years old this year, yay! I have a pen for everyone in the audience. No, I don't, but they are very But we are marking the year with a number of events, and our big event is November 23rd in Dublin Castle. So please keep an eye out for that. It'll be, my colleagues are putting a lot of effort into making it a really rich and interesting event. And really, we try and focus on medium to longer term strategic issues. And just transition was something that we were focusing on since 2019, and I've been working on it, and it's really interesting to see how it's beginning to slowly unfold. And how we can start making it grounded in practice, which is what I'm really interested in. The first piece of work we were asked by government in 2019 to look at in relation to jobs in the digital and low carbon transition as it was described. And in that, as Louise mentioned, we came up with a definition about the fair and equitable inclusive transition in terms of processes and outcomes. And that whole body of work, including Sinead Mercier's case studies, which are still really relevant, you might find them interesting, different international practices and work that we did, really tried to understand how different countries and how Ireland could progress just transition, particularly in relation to jobs. Since then, I suppose the work has been primarily in the Midlands and the EU funding in terms of getting that to the Midlands, but also in terms of thinking about just transition through the climate action plan and the principles that are now in that plan every year and how they are unfolding. And I think NET's most recent report is on just transition in agriculture and land use. And that's the piece of work that took us a year to do. It's a comprehensive look at agriculture, which I won't have time to get into. But what's interesting about it is that we really thought to embed just transition throughout it. So we tried to do it in terms of the process. We set up a stakeholder working group. We had visits to farms. We talked to farmers around the country, and we tried to bring that process of engagement in the heart of what we were doing, but also in the recommendations of the report. We also tried to embed just transition in other ways through the work. But I think a key message from me today, I suppose, is that it's grounding just transition in ways that both bring into view what it means for those impacted and for those working to embed it in policy and practice is the key challenge. And I think one of our first fundamental challenges was just transition is very different in agriculture than it is in other sectors. So a lot of the learning on just transition has been in energy. But when you look at agriculture, it's obviously got connection to biodiversity in the land in a way that other sectors don't, which makes it very interesting for work I'm doing now, but I won't get into that now. But I think the key also piece for us was navigating the transition from a farmer's perspective, to think about barriers and enablers for the transition for multiple small medium enterprises, like small individual farmers, mostly trying to navigate a transition that often has been more institutionalized for energy, you know, with bigger companies. So that was another key element. And we also found that farmers were not really taken with the idea of a just transition at the beginning of the work. They were a bit suspicious, I suppose, of it. So we had to rethink and ground it in a way in thinking about it. It's not a transition out of agriculture, but it's a transition into making optimal use of our land and agricultural resources for environmental, economic, and social sustainability. So that idea of not transitioning out, but staying in was, I think, critical. And the other things that we tried to embed was a real process of continuous learning, because we are recognizing the uncertainty, the synergies, the trade-offs that will happen in a transition. And you need to have that kind of trust and that sense of working together, because it's never going to be fixed in time exactly how you deliver the transition. So very briefly, just transition is embedded in the report in the socially and farmer inclusive processes, and there are a number of recommendations and issues around that. Enabling people to benefit from the opportunities of transition. So that's about vulnerabilities and looking at impact, but it's also around making opportunities very tangible to people who have been most affected. It's then about sharing and mitigating the cost of transition. And I think that's a key piece in the literature that's often overlooked, and somehow that's all going to happen over there. But that's actually where the real issues arise, is how do you share the costs? And lastly, it's around coordinating action and governance. And obviously, we think that's a critical piece of delivering a just transition, and a just transition commission will be really important from that perspective. So I think the method from the report is that agriculture and land use, the sectors can increasingly be part of the solution to addressing urgent climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think that reference to solution-focused, opportunity-led approach is important for thinking about the functions of just transition, which is often around protecting, impacts on the most vulnerable, which is crucially important. But I also think there needs to be a kind of anticipatory governance piece, thinking ahead to the risks and the opportunities that can enable transition to happen in a fair, inclusive, and just way. And lastly, I would just say that as well as the national focus of just transition, I'm also interested in the place-based approach. And I think it has to be people-centered, bottom-up, and place-based in many cases. And how do you do that in a way that links up the national with the local? And I think that's really important. So I'll stop there.
Jeanne, thanks very much for that excellent overview of NET work, and all of the reports. Just transition reports are available on the NET website. Sadhbh, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here back in DCU for me. And thank you, Diarmuid. You introduced me as the Climate Campaign Coordinator for Friends of the Earth and Coordinator for the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. But I think it would be more honest if I speak in a personal capacity, because I just wanted to be able to share some research that I conducted recently as well, that was in a different capacity. This is a very timely conversation and very timely piece of research, because all across Europe, we're starting to experience a backlash against climate policies. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind, that the political context for implementing climate policy is becoming more and more difficult. And we could spend all day talking about why that's the case. But the real question I would have that we could maybe think about is the extent to which the concept of just transition, whether that's embedded in law or policy, can inoculate us as a population in some way against this backlash, how we can build support for climate policies, and how we can kind of re-establish kind of trust between the various actors and institutions. Because without getting into all the detail, and we could again spend all day talking about it, we are in trouble we are in serious trouble. We are not going to meet our targets. We have a huge mountain of climate action ahead of us before 2030. And there's growing political opposition to the policies as they come into people's houses, your boilers, your car, your house, your farm, your land. All of these things are deeply threatening to people in many ways. And then you have the activities of bad actors, misinformation, disinformation, denial, and the kind of free-for-all that's exploding on social media at times. And all of that matters, because when we're talking about just transition, we're talking about concepts that they are readily understood and absorbed by people with the same interpretation. And I'm afraid I don't think that's the case. We have a situation as well, and it depends on the political context in different countries, where some political actors, particularly in the centre-right and far-right, are quite allergic to the concept of social justice in principle. So how do you bed it down in legislation and insulate the population in future by introducing the concept of just transition in law? Is it effective as a way of inoculating against those kind of trends? Now, I'll come back to some of those points, but what I wanted to do was just share with you, and it's kind of coincidental, to be honest. I had done a study for the Climate Change Advisory Council over the last 8 months on carbon budgeting, looking at a select group of countries that include the UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, New Zealand, Finland, and the EU as a whole. And I was looking at carbon budgets, but when I was doing the study, I also looked at just transition and how that featured in the different framework laws. So I'm just going to run through some of the examples of how they feature, because they're kind of a bit of a spoiler alert for your next piece of work, but they're also different to the countries that Vilja has already mentioned, including Finland to start with, for example. There's no mention of just transition, but there is a reference to ensuring sustainable development. And even though the Google Translate might not have been brilliant, the way it comes to me is justice of the climate measures, which is a kind of funny phrase in English, but I don't know, maybe there's a better translation of that. And in 2021, the Finnish Climate Change Panel actually produced a report on justice in climate policy. And again, we haven't seen that coming from our Climate Change Advisory Council, so it will be an interesting way or an interesting direction for them to take. In France, there are measures under an ecological transition contract to support fossil fuel dependent regions. But I think the more interesting example is probably in the case of the Netherlands. There's no reference to just transition in the law, but it has had a very interesting political context in the form of climate agreements that are done on a sectoral basis. And these were actually strengthened after a campaign to ensure that there was fair costs of climate implementation incorporated into the agreements. And these agreements led to the Dutch target for 2030 being increased. But of course, the interesting thing in the Netherlands case is, of course, the sense on the one hand that the stakeholder dialogue piece left ordinary citizens behind. So there was a backlash against the stakeholder dialogue. And then, of course, we had the emergence of the BBB party more recently in the regional elections, which again is trying to push back against this idea of elite stakeholders, which is not now just government institutions, but elite environmental groups and what have you, doing deals over the heads of the public. And New Zealand is another case where you have various references throughout their legislation about taking vulnerable groups into account, a little bit like the Irish one, but it's regarded as, by one academic analyst, generally muddled and unspecified. So I think that kind of comment might apply to some of the kind of legislative provisions we have in the Irish Act as well. And lastly, to look at Denmark, their legislation, which is really very brief, states that the green transition is possible while maintaining a strong welfare society, which I think is an interesting inclusion. So just transition per se is not common in a lot of the language set down in climate laws. And it seems to be understood in a variety of different ways. So one of the things, again, when you look at the European climate law, is that the European climate law refers to fairness and solidarity as principles And then it refers to loads of other kind of EU speak about regions and the differences between member states. So it has a different take on just transition, but clearly has developed a financial mechanism to support just transition. So basically, we're coming back to some of the questions that in a way, Louise and Jeanne have already answered about how do we define just transition? What does it mean? And I suppose my contribution is really that just transition is often conflated with lots of other concepts around social justice, environmental justice, distributive justice, and it creates a number of interpretive possibilities. But rather than getting caught up, and I studied normative political philosophy, rather than getting caught up in the normative potential, I think we have to look at the political context and the institutional context in which these principles are going to be operationalized, because that's ultimately what really matters on the ground. So what I'm suggesting is that while we need to take from the experiences of other countries, we need to define just transition in Ireland in ways that make sense to us, that people understand. For example, I have a kind of an instinct about this, and I'd love to hear what people think, that the word fairness means something more tangible to people than the concept of justice in ordinary language. We could speak all day about what justice means, and of course it matters. So the establishment of a task force now, which is the next step in the Irish context, gives us the possibility to tease out some of these options before we embark on the establishment of a formal Just Transition Commission. But I think we need to learn from a lot of the lessons that have been experienced by the Just Transition Commissioner already in the past few years. And one of them is, and I'm not the expert here, there are many of you who actually are more familiar with the details, but my sense is that there's on the ground institutional overlap, multiple mandates kind of potentially conflicting or tripping over each other. There's a demand side issue in terms of, do people want to just transition? Are there people who want to be reskilled, retrained, and all the rest of it? Funding is not the problem, which is interesting. We used to have that as the major obstacle to everything in Ireland, but now we don't have funding as an excuse. So we need to tease out what the political issues are, and we need to perhaps slow down some of the agencies that are galloping ahead, Gordon Mona particularly, slow them down so that they're moving at the same pace as everybody else. So sorry, my comments are a little bit scattergun. I'm really excited to be here and hope that we can get into some conversation. Thank you.